Hello. Some astrologers have had this idea that there is a connection between music and the positions of the planets. So as the planets are moving, they're going around the sun, they're emitting a frequency or a vibration. And that vibration creates a sound. And it's a frequency that we do not hear with our ears, but nevertheless, a sound is being generated. And this is often considered to be part of a larger concept of a music of the spheres, that in some way our solar system, the universe in general, is like a cosmic symphony, but we cannot hear it with our human ears, but nevertheless it is there. And I'm going to share with you today some of the ideas that people have had about this, and a relatively new idea that I think fits actually better. So this is exciting because people have been wrestling with this idea that there's a music of the spheres for a long time. And with all the thought that's been put into it for so long, there are advancements. Oh, this is very, very interesting. Now, here's the basic idea that has been used historically by many people, such as, for example, one of the most famous people who promoted this idea is Johannes Kepler. And the idea that Kepler had is very simple and straightforward. It's just like when you play a note on a guitar. So when you play the top note on a guitar, a six-string guitar that's tuned in the usual way, the top note is E. And when you play the high E, the E an octave higher, you have actually cut the string in half. You're playing half of the length of the string. So there's a direct relationship between the length of the string and the note you're playing. So it becomes very straightforward. What Kepler did, and he was not the first person to do this, is he's looking at the distance between the planets. So here we're looking at a chart wheel, happens to be Paramahansa Yogananda, and Venus and Jupiter are in a very close trine aspect, 1/3 of a circle, which is 120 degrees. Well, what happens if you think of the entire circle here as like a round string, and you play 1/3 of the length of the string? Similarly, when Yogananda was born, the sun is square Jupiter. What note do you get if you play 1/4 of the string? And that is the note that's being played in the sky. So it's really simple and straightforward. Whatever fraction of the sky is between the planets is just like that distance between the planets vibrating as a percentage of the whole circle. So only certain angular distances are going to play notes. And Kepler's idea is that those angular distances that produced notes, actually they're musical intervals. So that distance of 1/3 of a string, how much higher does it raise the pitch as opposed to the whole circle? What is that change in the note that's happening? So that's the idea, and only certain angular distances are going to produce the kind of notes that we're familiar with on our scale. And what you end up with is this. You end up with an opposition aspect, two planets' opposition to each other, is dividing the entire circle in half, and when you take a string and you cut it in half, you go up an octave. So the opposition is an octave. It raises the note by 1 octave. The square, when you play 1/4 of the length of a string, you get, let's see, 1/4 I've got here is a perfect fourth. So the note, if you start with the note C, from C to F, is called a fourth. So that fourth is the note you get when you play 1/4 of a string. So therefore a square creates the fourth. And a trine, when you play 2/3 of the length of a string, you get a perfect fifth. So Kepler's idea is that the trine creates a fifth. So this aspect of Venus to Jupiter is creating the same musical note that we get when we go from the note C up a fifth to G. So that's the way that we convert planetary positions into notes. That's the basic idea of how it's done. Now, what's interesting, I've got again the quote from this from an article. I give the reference on the previous slide. It's an article by an astrologer, David Plant, where he relates this information from Kepler's books. And interestingly, Kepler's idea was also given by Ptolemy way back, in the second century. So in astrology, we often think of Ptolemy as having written the Tetrabiblos, these fundamental ideas we use in astrology. We often do not associate Ptolemy with a music of the spheres and a harmony of the universe, but he was. He wrote a book called the Harmonics, where he described how the music of the spheres worked. So part of Ptolemy's interest in astrology is also in this music of the spheres. And Ptolemy presented several ideas, one of which is the same as the idea that Kepler presented much later. And he also played around with other ideas. So in Ptolemy's book, The Harmonics, he talks about how, I'm quoting here from a book by a fellow Bruce Stephenson, or Stevenson, however he pronounces it, on his summary of what's in Ptolemy's three-part book, The Harmonics. And Stephenson says that low pitches are associated with rising and setting points, high pitches with the midheaven. So Ptolemy, way back in the second century, had this feeling that as a planet rises in the east, so as, for example, the sun is rising in the east, the note is getting higher and higher. It's kind of an intuitively appealing idea that as a planet comes up, reaches its culmination, it reaches its highest note and then goes down as it sets. So, it's just intuitively appealing idea. So Ptolemy was playing around with different ideas. He also had this idea that the sizes and motions, reading here from the quote from this book, that the sizes and motions of planetary spheres are in proportions determined by the same fundamental laws that rule the science of harmonics. So the idea here is that you could look at the size of the planet, how fast it's going, and think about a musical string that's in the same proportion as the size of the planets and how fast they're going, and they're just like strings vibrating. So this is another idea. Now my point is that astrologers for nearly 2,000 years, and probably longer than that, have been thinking about some kind of celestial music, and how could we find that formula and translate it and make it audible to humans. A lot of different ideas that were experimented with. Okay, now, by the way, I went to my guitar, and just to prove this to myself, I measured the length of the strings on the guitar, and on my guitar the length happens to be 25.5 inches, nearly exactly. And then I played the octave higher, and I measured the distance. And sure enough, it was 12.7 inches of the string that's vibrating. And then I took that 25.5 inches, multiplied it by 1/3 is 8.5 inches. And so of the 25.5 inches, 8.5 inches is the part that's not vibrating when I play. And the other 2/3, that's 1/3, is the part that is vibrating. So when you're playing those lower notes on the guitar, you're playing most of the string. You're playing 2/3 of it. So when you're playing 2/3, that is the perfect fourth. Okay, so that's, I've got a typo here. When you're playing 1/3 of the string, that's the perfect fifth. Okay, so there's a typo here. Sorry about that. is the perfect fifth. And when you're playing 1/4 of the string, it's the perfect fourth. This should say perfect fifth. Okay. All right. So anyway, you can prove it to yourself. Just measure the length of the string and you'll see that it's true. Now, here's the alternative idea. A different way, a different formula for translating angular distances between planets to notes. It's a different idea. It's also very simple. Here's the idea. You take the circle, divide it into, for example, 5 pieces. You can take it and divide it by any number. If I take the circle and divide it into 5 pieces, and if I'm starting on the left, as I'm showing here in this image in the upper left corner, I have 1/5, 2/5, 3/5. It's called 2/5 here because it's 2/5 the shortest distance. We have the 1/5 and 2/5 distances measuring the short way from any point. Or we can divide by 7. We get 1/7, 2/7, 3/7. Or divide by 9. Get 1/9, 2/9, 3/9, which also equals 1/3, and 4/9. Now here's the idea. It's this very, very similar. We think of the whole circle as a vibrating string. But now we think of this distance between the planets when it's 1/5 of a circle as vibrating 5 times higher. So we're getting a pitch that's 5 times higher. And when we divide it into 7, we get a pitch that's 7 times higher. And the difference with this formula is that if the distance is 1/5 of a circle, happens to be 72 degrees, or if it's 144 degrees, 2/5, it's still based on the denominator of the fraction. We've divided the circle by 5. So it does not matter whether the planets are 1/5 or 2/5. We have increased the frequency by 5 times. Okay? And the only difference between the 1/5 aspect and the 2/5 aspect is that there's a different tone quality. Just like if you play the note A or any note on a guitar, on a trumpet, if you sing it, if you produce it in different ways, you get different overtones, they're sometimes called, or different harmonics, they're sometimes called, and it creates different tone quality. And that's what's happening with the difference between 1/5 and 2/5. So the idea is that all fifths of a circle create the same note. They'll create the same pitch with different qualities. Same thing with sevenths and ninths. So that's the idea. Now, to summarize, looking at our middle paragraph here, according to this theory, and this is the one I think makes more sense, frankly, is number one, to get the pitch equivalent of an angular distance, you have to find out what fraction that angular distance is of the whole circle. So if two planets are 72 degrees, it may not be intuitively obvious that that's 1/5 of a circle, or that, say, 160 degrees is 4/9 of a circle. And when you take sevenths, it does not come out to be a whole number of degrees. 1/7 is 51 3/7 degrees of a circle. So you have to somehow figure out what fraction of a circle it is, and then you multiply by that number, and you find out what note that is, and now you have the note. So that's the idea. And point number 2 in this second paragraph, the denominator, so if it's 2/7, it's the 7, it determines the frequency. The numerator is not as important in that sense. It is important because different tone qualities are important. If I'm playing a guitar, it sounds very different from any other instrument. So it makes a big difference in that sense. And we respond differently to different instruments. So it does make a difference, but the pitch is the same. So the numerator affects tone quality, the denominator affects the pitch. And that is the idea. Now, to give you some examples of how the pitch is different with you might say the standard or traditional formula, and this new formula, this you might call it harmonic or vibrational formula, whatever words we want to give to it. Here's an example. The square in the traditional formula comes out to be a perfect fourth. In the new formula, we have a square is 2 octaves up, because cutting the string in half goes up an octave, and then a square cuts it in half again, you've gone up another octave. So what happens with the new formula is the sounds are going up to very high notes very rapidly. Okay, so we get these very big differences. In fact, with the new formula, the opposition goes up 1 octave. That agrees with Kepler and other people with the traditional formula. The square goes up a 2nd octave. The 1/8 aspect, which is 45 degrees, that's going to go up to the 3rd octave. So the celestial music covers a wider range of octaves than humans listen to. So celestial music and human music are not on the same exact level. There are some differences. And this is what I intuitively think makes more sense. I do not expect the celestial music and the human music to be completely identical. There's overlaps and similarities, but the human range of hearing does not define reality. Reality is bigger than us, and the celestial music has a greater range of octaves than the human ear is capable of. Okay, and for example, a quintile, the 1/5 of a circle, or the 2/5, the frequency is going to be 5 times a quote base frequency. Nobody knows what this base frequency is, or even if we have to have it, but the idea is it's 5 times higher than a conjunction. Okay, and in a minute I'll tell you what note that is. Okay, so with this new formula, the vibration is not the fraction of the circle that you're playing. It's not exactly like a guitar string. And also, let's take a different denominator, a 1/15, a 2/15, a 4/15, a 7/15. All of these aspects have the same pitch. They will have different tone quality, but they have the same pitch. Okay. All right. Some other differences between this new theory and the traditional theory, and 2 reasons why this new idea was probably not embraced earlier on, is that with this new idea, the first note from your base frequency jumps up an octave. So your next note is the opposition, which is an octave higher. And then the other notes are even higher than that. So intuitively you might think, whoa, hold on, man, where's my first octave? With your theory, I don't have a musical scale, so it feels like it doesn't work. Well, sometimes when you're on a path of discovery, you have to follow all the threads and see where things end up, and we're going to see it ends up being okay. It might not seem okay now, but it's okay. We'll see how this works out, that we jump from our conjunction up an octave to the opposition, and all of the other notes are even higher than that. Okay, so that could throw people off right from the beginning. And this leads to the second conclusion, that the harmony of the spheres, this celestial music, works a little bit differently from the human music, as I said. And one thing the ancients did not know that we know now is that light, just like music, exists in waves. So the different colors of light are different frequencies. So is astrology really a music of the spheres, or is it the light of the spheres? And interestingly, Vedic astrology, another word for Vedic astrology is Jyotish. And Jyotish, one translation of Jyotish, is the science of light. So is astrology a science of light or a science of sound? I think it incorporates qualities of both. It is not either one exactly, but it is also vibrational and a different kind of vibration, just like light and sound are different kinds of vibrations, and they're both fundamental to life. So sound has octaves. Light does not obviously have octaves. It's not like you double the frequency of red and now you have a new red, and you double that and you have a new red. You go from it's part of an electromagnetic spectrum where the different frequencies actually have different kinds of effects. So the astrological vibrations do have octaves, like music, but it's not going to have everything identical to music. So that's one thing to keep in mind. We use this term music of the spheres, and yes, there is a music of the spheres, but that music is going to have some differences from human music. Okay, I'm just proposing this. Nobody knows how it works, but we make some guesses that seem reasonable, we work them out, and we see if we can apply the ideas. So I'm suggesting that Kepler was on the right track. He was in the Pythagorean tradition, guessing that vibration is fundamental to astrology, guessing that there's a music of the spheres, working very intensively on it, and that there is more to astrology aspects than taking twelfths of a circle. Okay? So, but I think where Kepler went off is he made his model of the music of the spheres too strictly the same as human music, and insisted that aspects must conform to human music. So, all of the great geniuses and people who've made discoveries, whether we're talking about Kepler or Newton or Einstein, they make tremendous breakthroughs, but not every single thing they have said is correct. And many hundreds and hundreds of years later, hopefully we can figure out something and advance it. And that's what I'm suggesting that we're able to do. Now, what notes do we get using this new idea? By the way, on the subject of sound, I don't know if you hear that or not, but it's starting to rain here. So if you hear a little sound in the background, I don't know if I will find out when I listen to this whether you hear that. But if you do, it's raining here. Okay. So what sounds do we get? Okay. So let's, for example, use the note A at 110. Then the opposition aspect is going to be 220. The trine will be 3 times. 1/3 will be 330. A square will be 440. A quintile and a biquintile will be 550. A sextile will be 660. So, and the sevenths will be 770 and the eighths 880. We just multiply the denominator by the base frequency. So we'll pick any frequency we want, just arbitrarily. We'll use 110 as our base number. And what note is 220? Well, that's the octave. It's an octave higher. You can go online and find websites. I think I might have one up here still. Oh, one of these websites, maybe I shouldn't have jumped here. Yeah, here it is. Here's a website, for example, which is showing the frequency. The first column is the frequency for every note. Frequency note. And if I go down to 110, I see that A, this 2 means second octave, is 110. If I go down to 220, I see that A at the next octave is 220. So I can look for 330, which is exactly what I did, and look at that, it's extremely close to the note E, but up an octave. It's gone up an octave. It's not A to E, it's A to E up another octave. But it lands almost exactly on it. E at the next octave is 329.63, so a trine makes a perfect fifth according to this formula. It comes out almost exact. So all you have to do is multiply 110 is the number I used. You can use any number actually. That's a note. The note A is handy because it's a round number. The others you'll notice are fractions. So I took 110, and you just look it up in the table and find out what note it is. So the trine comes out to be a perfect fifth. I put almost exactly, because in this table, again, the note E is 329.63. I'm starting in A. The note E in the key of A is a perfect fifth. By coincidence, this agrees with the formula used by Kepler. Okay? Most of these notes are not going to agree. But interestingly, both formulas show that the trine is a perfect fifth. So if you have a trine aspect in your chart, it's giving a sound similar to a perfect fifth. Now, the fourth harmonic is the next octave. So I mentioned that before. A square is not a perfect fourth. It is actually an octave. It's a perfect fourth according to the traditional formula. But here we come up with the idea that a square is jumping up another octave. And the quintiles, the 5 vibration aspects, the 1/5 and 2/5, are 550. We can jump to our table here and see that it's extremely close to a C sharp. And in the key of a C sharp is a major third. So 550 is very close to being a major third. Very, very close in what we call the equal temperament, equally temperament. What is it? Equal temperament scale. Equally tempered scale, sometimes called. The scale that we normally use. There's some other ideas about it. But in any case, it comes out to be very close to a major third. And 660 is the next octave of the trine. So with this new formula, the trines and sextiles have almost the same note. Now that makes sense, because in astrology we consider trines and sextiles to have a similar meaning. And here, a sextile is simply the next octave. It's a fifth up an octave. And similarly, we consider oppositions and squares to both be hard aspects. And using this formula, the square is just another octave, another hard aspect moving up. And as you move up an octave, you do change the quality. The note functions a little bit differently, but is very, very similar. So one thing I like about this new formula or alternative formula is that it fits very well with the way that we interpret things. We don't think of the sextile note as being so completely different from a trine, and we think of a sextile as being similar to a trine and very different from a square. That's exactly what we get here. So this is why I like this alternative way of translating planetary distances to notes. Okay. Also interesting, look at the notes we have so far. A, E, C sharp. If you are trained in musical theory, bingo! That you recognize that. That's the A major chord. So our first vibrations, the 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, actually you only have to go to 5, and then E is repeated again, create a major chord. Well, that's aesthetically pleasing that our lowest vibrations, which set a foundation for vibrations in general, are also the most fundamental notes in a Western scale, our basic major chord. So we're seeing a lot of similarities using this model, and that's what I expect. I do not expect a perfect equivalence, because I don't think the music of the spheres is a perfect equivalence, but we're going to see some strong similarities, some, well, to use a bad pun, resonances, since we're talking about sound, between how the music of the spheres works and how human music works. And that's exactly what we're seeing. So the model makes sense. Now, on this slide, I've shown the first 16 harmonics. So what I've shown you so far is the first 6, and we'll just keep adding 110. 7th harmonic is going to be 110 times 7. 8 is 110 times 880. And then we go to that table on a website, for example, and see what note it is. And here's what we find out. Of course, the octaves are perfect. The 220 is A at the next octave, 440 is A. The 8th harmonic is A, 16th harmonic is A. That's exactly how we think of these aspects in harmonic astrology and vibrational astrology, even in a system of astrology called Uranian astrology. We think of them as all hard aspects. They all come out as the same note at different octaves. It's beautiful. It fits together nicely. So let's go see here. The 7 vibration aspects come out a little flat of the note G. Okay, the note G in the key of A is often called a minor 7th. So that's the note, and it doesn't come out perfect. It's a little bit flat of that G note. And the 9 vibration comes out very close to the B note, one step up in the key of A. So 9 vibration is like one step, one smooth step up, and so on. The 5 and 10, they're doubles of each other. They're both C sharp. 11 does not end up clearly on a note. This is, I think, very fascinating. 11 vibration does not land nicely on a Western scale note. It falls about halfway between D and D sharp in the key of A. Some people say it is the D sharp, but actually it's falling about halfway between D and D sharp. This makes sense. It's very amazing. The 11 vibration we look at in vibrational astrology as very dynamic, very unstable, very kind of out of the box, not comfortable in the normal way of doing things. Well, musically it makes sense. 11 does not sit nicely in our typical musical scales. 12 becomes E, and so on. The 13th harmonic also doesn't fit perfectly. It's a little closer to F than F sharp in the key of A. This also makes sense because 13 is moving beyond the norm. It wants to get engaged in something special. It gets tired of everything seems mediocre. It's trying to break out of that box. So again, these vibrations that are not landing nicely on notes, does that mean they don't exist, which is what Kepler was guessing? Actually, they do exist because the cosmic vibrations, the vibrational astrology, is much richer and more complex than the limits of human music. And people do vibrate to these things. They do move outside our standard scales, and so on. And we can look at it. 14 is a multiple of 7. 15 ends up very slightly flat of G sharp in the key of A. So it's very interesting how this works out and how it's very similar. And on this slide, I show you the first 32 harmonics. So now I've shown you up to 16. Here's what you see when you go up to 32. Now, interestingly, I started working out what note these are, and then I was using Google to find things, and I noticed, oh, I am doing a lot of extra work. At Wikipedia, at this website here, they already have this table. So after I worked out most of it, I just copied the values from the table at the Wikipedia article. And an interesting thing happens when you look at all 32. You can spend some time looking at this and thinking about it on your own. But let me summarize a few things. Number one, when you go up to the 32nd harmonic, which has been kind of a cutoff point, when you get harmonics above 32 in vibrational astrology, they become more and more purely mental, more abstract. When you go up to the 32nd harmonic, every one of the 12 notes is there. Now that's pretty cool that we do get all 12 notes. We also get 3 vibrations that do not come close to notes. I mentioned 11, 13, and also 31. And it's very interesting because 31 also is really interesting. It seems to have this sense of mystery, of something not definable, and it works out when we look at it that it also does not fall nicely on a note. The 11th harmonic, if we start with 110 as our base, is 1210. So 110 times 11 is 1210. And that, if you look it up in one of the tables, is almost exactly halfway between D and D sharp. Excuse me, D and D sharp. 51% sharp of D and 49% flat of D sharp. It's really, you might say, way out of tune from our normal scales, musical scales. And the 13th harmonic is 41% sharp, 40 to 41% sharp, 59 to 60% flat of the next note, falling between F and F sharp. And the 31st harmonic is 45% sharp of G sharp and 55% flat. In other words, just very, very slightly short of being at the octave. Every other note falls within 1/3 of a note. Some are a little bit off, like D is 29% flat of being the note D. But my point is this. I hope you're not swimming with too many numbers. My point is simple. If you think of the frequency as being close enough to a note when it's within 1/3 of the difference between the notes, then only 3 of these frequencies fall outside of notes, and the others fall on notes, some more precisely than others, and all 12 notes are there. And the ones that do not fall precisely on notes, like 7 vibration, which is 31% flat, 21, the 7, 14, 21, 28, they have a kind of mysterious out-of-the-box feeling, but not as extreme, not as uncomfortable, you might say, with being in like a normal, plain, vanilla environment as 11, 13, and 31. Basic point is this. You're going to see some nice similarities between the notes and the vibrations. Here under the table, I speculate on the 17 is a half step, 19 is a minor third, and so on, and how that might make sense. The tritone, you can think of as a flatted fifth, is a very interesting musical interval. It cuts the octave in half, but it's very dissonant. Some of the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church tried to avoid this interval. It's a very interesting interval. Anyway, it gets associated with 23 vibration, and I think that makes sense too. 23 is like a calculated risk, seeking something outside the standard and seeing how to get there. Anyway, it fits pretty well. The harmonics up to 32 fit all 12 notes. The system works very nicely. For me, there are critically important things here, like the way we interpret hard aspects all being octaves of each other, or any doubling having the same effect. It just makes sense. And what it means is that the note, for example, this C sharp for 5 vibration, or any of them, say G for 14 vibration, all of them, they're not in the same octave as the conjunction. They've moved up octaves. And I think that's okay. The celestial music is not identical to the human music. It has a great range, and it does this. But when you reduce it down to all being within an octave, you see that all 12 notes are there. Okay, so the basic idea is that people have been searching for the formula for this translation of human notes and sound frequencies to the cosmos and to astrology. And this is a formula that I think fits. It agrees with the way we think about aspects better than the original attempt. So it seems like a more reasonable way to do it. Here is some thoughts about how the notes of different vibrations, they do seem to fit the meanings of the vibrations. I'm not going to go into all this detail. You can stop and read this. I don't even think it's that essential that every vibration match our feeling about notes, because there's much more that affects the meaning of a vibration than the note. Let me say that again. What note a vibration comes out to be, if this formula is correct, I do not think is the only thing, and probably not even the most important thing that affects the quality of the vibration, but it may play a part in it, and it seems to be fairly consistent. In other videos, I talk about what contributes to the meaning of a vibration, and I can make more videos about that. The point is this: there is a music of the spheres. I think we have found a very reasonable formula, a more reasonable formula than the original one, for making a translation of human music to cosmic music. We could call it astrological music. Okay, so conclusions. The theory of associations of musical intervals and frequencies with astrological aspects, the formula that I'm presenting to you is consistent with number one, the finding that the 11th, 13th, and 31st harmonics are outside the mainstream or norm. At least they are in the work we do in vibrational astrology. And they're outside, they don't fall nicely on standard notes. Number two, the interpretation of aspects in vibrational astrology agrees very well with the intervals that we're finding. And it agrees with the overall theory. For example, in vibrational astrology, we believe all harmonics are important, not just the ones that agree with human music. There's a huge amount of evidence now for this. It's very clear that it's true, so we have a theory of converting angular distances to musical notes that's consistent with our understanding that all of these vibrations are important. Number three, as I mentioned, what we call octave harmonics in VA. If you take any harmonic like 7 and double it, 7, 14, 28, 56, 112, you keep doubling it, you get similar effects, and that's what we're seeing here. We're just seeing a beautiful consistency with how we interpret things, how we understand things using this formula. And we see that the effect of different harmonics appears to be fairly consistent with the notes that we obtain. So it's fitting well. For example, a trine is a very basic aspect. A perfect fifth is one of the most basic intervals. So you have a basic aspect matching a basic interval. It's just a general good consistency here. If we found that it didn't fit our way of thinking about aspects, we would have to throw out the idea. But it works very, very well. And also, point number 5, the expectation that there are close associations, but not a perfect translation of astrology to musical scales. My assumption is we're dealing with something that's fractal, and it's self-similar, not self-identical, and that the astrological frequencies have things in common with light, and they have some things in common with sound, and we'll see some blending and similarity between ideas. And that's exactly my point. Points 5 and 6 here are different sides of the same thing, and that's what I'm emphasizing here. That the cosmic waves or astrological waves, I should call them astrological waves, are similar, and that we have this fundamental realization that waves in some form are fundamental to light, to sound, and to astrology. I think that's my last slide. Oh, one more? Yeah, one more slide. I just want to mention that vibrational astrology is a system of astrology that is very evidence-based. It's built on the Pythagorean tradition, which is Pythagoras, Kepler, John Addy, etc. And I want to also mention, in case you're new to vibrational astrology, that vibrational astrology is very sophisticated. The astrological interpretation, the rules, our understanding of how it works, the way we use vibrational astrology in natal, compatibility, forecasting, relocation, it's a very complete, intricate, sophisticated system. We are just now, in the last few years, beginning to explore how vibrational astrology is related to other areas. I just made a video recently on vibrational healing and vibrational astrology, and here we're beginning our first development, our first beginning insights into relating vibrations to music. So this is relatively new, and not the heart of vibrational astrology and the huge amount of information and the techniques that work so beautifully in astrological interpretation. And the vibrational astrology community is very well developed. There are online classes being given by different vibrational astrologers. There's an annual conference in Gainesville, Florida. Let's see if I have the website up for that. Here's the website. Let me drag this over a little bit there. If you go to conference and then vibrational astrology conference, here's the information about the conference in 2020. It's every year. In 2020, it's March 27 to 29. I just wanted to make that clear that vibrational astrology is now beginning to expand out into understanding relationships to music, to healing, and things like that. But it's already well developed in other respects. Okay, well, I hope you found that interesting, my friends. Take care. God bless. Namaste.